A warm welcome back to the channel. My name is Tom and you're watching youtube.com/GetNuanced, and this is the first in what I hope to be many editions of the GetNuanced podcast, which will be primarily a series of different video and audio only podcasts where I discuss current events, international relations such as the geopolitics that define our global and societal landscape at large, and also historical figures that I personally find interesting. A lot of times I'm going to go off on a ramble, so apologies ahead of time, but the overarching point here is that I'm going to try to convey to you guys topics that I find interesting and hopefully inspire other people to share and also provide their own interesting takes on these different topics, as well as other concepts related to such matters. And yeah, that's just going to be the plan, and we'll see what happens. We'll play it by ear, but I figured out that I have a little bit of excess time, and I want to make sure that I try to set the groundwork here for a set schedule, and this will just be a testing of how this will go. So the first episode kind of just, like alpha in terms of its the phase. We're definitely going to have changes as it is able to gain traction, and hopefully it will, because I think these topics are interesting. So the first one is actually on a figure who I'm relatively surprised doesn't have a lot of people providing videos on, or at least not on YouTube. I mean, I remember watching the TV special on Aurelian, the Roman emperor, whom was given the title Restitutor Orbis, which means restorer of the world in Latin. And he only reigned for 5 years, in between 270 and 275 AD, but despite the brevity of his reign, he is actually one of the most consequential, and actually one of my personally favorite Roman emperors in all of the history of the Roman Empire. And that is really saying something, since there are a lot of emperors, and some were good, some were bad, like, most politicians. I mean, a lot of them were bad, actually. Aurelian, on the other hand, though, had redeemed the genuine glory of the office of Roman Emperor, in the sense that despite only spending 5 years on the throne, he had accomplished more than some other emperors before and after him would do when twice or three times the amount of time. Some emperors, such as Augustus or Justinian or Basil II, had reigned for decades, and their accomplishments were nothing to scoff at. But considering the length of their reign, I mean, time in that sense, when you have all that extra time, Aurelian's life was unfortunately cut short. And that's the cat in the background, and now she jumped on the back. So if you hear her, hopefully you enjoy the sound of cats periodically. If not, sorry. But anyways, when it comes to Aurelian, he had only spent 5 years, and then he was assassinated, which I will get into afterwards. But despite that, in his 5 years, he had accomplished a lot. When he had first become emperor, succeeding the Emperor Quintillus, who was actually the son of another emperor whom Aurelian had deposed, I think. Yes, I think he deposed that emperor. And in terms of the broader, situation, actually, he was the son of, I think, Claudius, actually, yes. Despite doing so, being just a usurper, essentially, he had really legitimized himself after suffering one victory at the hands of the Vandals, whom in later Roman history would have a more important role. But this time, they were one of the many migrating Germanic tribes that have crossed the Rhine in modern-day Germany and had entered Rome, the Roman world, and especially in particular the Roman heartland of Italy, where Rome, the capital, was centered at. And this was something in and of itself that had, up until very recently, not been something that the citizens of Rome had ever had to experience, not since before the days of the early empire and Augustus. There had been, for centuries now, a Pax Romana, or Roman peace, and it was only with the death of Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, and the end of the Antonine Nerva dynasty, that Rome had gone from a nation, or I guess an empire, that was largely peaceful for its citizens, and maybe with large exceptions, probably, with a couple of exceptions I'll definitely get into another video, but with few exceptions, one of the greatest countries in history in terms of its ability as a geopolitical superpower. It had turned the Mediterranean Sea, which today, if you check in the East in particular, there is a lot of contentions going on between the countries that border it, such as Libya, Lebanon, Palestine, what are the other countries? Israel, and Egypt. Turkey, all of these different countries, along with Russia, and I'm sure the Western great powers are obviously monitoring the situation as well. This area is highly contested, and the Romans had controlled the entire Mediterranean. They would have famously referred to it as Mare Nostrum, which in Latin means our sea. And at the time of Aurelian, that peace that most of the people for centuries had taken largely now for granted had come just completely into just being a distant memory that would continue to fade as the Roman Empire was plunged into a crisis known as the crisis of the 3rd century. This was a time of tremendous political instability and just societal transition from the end of a prosperous era where most cities in the empire had not had to have walls and defensive structures surrounding them, as the Roman legions were mostly the ones doing the attacks and military actions. They were attacking usually. They were not on the defensive. And after the times of Aurelian and the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, this would be something that would just become further a distant memory, since now Rome was constantly on the defensive. Aurelian, in fact, actually built the famous Aurelian walls, which are still standing today in modern Rome, Italy. And those walls are really symbolic in the sense that the fact that now the Romans had to build a series of defensive structures around their capital city meant that, in general, all these other cities of Rome would follow the precedent, such as Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, and in the future, obviously, a city of Constantinople, which I actually made a video on, the walls of Constantinople, and their creator, Anthemius, which I will include in the video description below if you're interested in checking that out. I recommend it, as they have their own history that's pretty interesting in and out itself. And I'm definitely going to talk about more of the Byzantine Empire as well. But it's funny I mentioned that, actually, because if it wasn't for Aurelian, there would really have not been an Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. At the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, when Aurelian had ascended the throne, the very future of Rome was within question. Many thought that the Roman Empire was falling, and who could blame them? If you looked at both the Western and Eastern provinces, there were separatist movements, such as in the West, the Gallic Empire, which was a breakaway empire of sorts, which had remained culturally Roman, but had its own independent legions that rebelled and essentially were their own military, and a person that claimed the title of Augustus, which, if we weren't familiar, this was not a time yet when there were multiple Roman emperors at any given point. If someone were to, in particular, mostly military generals or people that had some sort of political clout, like if they were in the Senate, if they were to have referred to themselves as an Augustus, that would mean that they themselves were claiming to be the sole Roman emperor, which at the time, until after, which had Aurelian's successor Diocletian starting the Tetrarchy, and later having future emperors such as Valentinian and Valens, or Theodosius dividing the empire into different divisions for different reasons, such as easier at management, in the sense that obviously as things kept getting worse and worse for the Romans, even after the crisis of the 3rd century, things might have gotten a little bit better, but things were never really 100% ever again. There was never going to be this grand Pax Romana anymore. And the emperor, Diocletian, was the first to realize that at this point, it was no longer a reality in which the Roman emperor could be just one person and be expected to manage all of the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, which had stretched all the way from modern Scotland to the Syrian deserts and had linked all these different countries today that surround the Mediterranean to a single political entity that had just been, bar none, the military superpower of its time. The only other country that was really able to ever equal it in terms of its sophistication, culturally, militarily, and politically, were the neighboring Iranians, which were originally the Parthians and then the Sassanid Persians under the House of Sassan, which they'll get into this whole story at the very end of it. And long term, I definitely will talk about them a lot more, because they were the other superpower which had tried to contest with Rome for supremacy over the Middle East, much like in modern day where we have Russians, Americans, and Chinese all fighting over in the Middle East, and in various ways, usually indirectly, just like the Romans and the Persians had their own client states in the Lakhmids and Ghassanids, respectively. the modern day superpowers or geopolitical great powers all have their different proxies and clients on the ground in these different regions. And I'll end it up in a different video, but you can just tell now, obviously, this is a complex situation. And Aurelian himself was actually a man of the military. He was one of a series of soldier emperors or barracks emperors. These were emperors whom had gained legitimacy not through being declared emperor by the Senate and people, which was still in theory the real and only way that you could actually have the political legitimacy to call yourself an Augustus. No, that was not the case. In reality, Rome had been transitioning ever since the times of Augustus, when he never really restored the Republic, but he did so in the symbolic gesture of not being called a king. But in fact, when it came to the actual power of Rome, it had not, at that point, it was going to start being a period such as the Principate, where the emperor was the one at the end of the day who had supreme authority. The Senate would continue to exist in various forms, but in reality would never have the level of power and independence politically that it enjoyed during the Republican era. And at the end of the day, when it came to the emperor, he really was a military dictator, but he had to come off as something more. He claimed divine authority. Each Roman emperor, or at least the classical emperors from the time of Augustus to the age of Constantine, had, and even afterwards, I think the last emperor to be deified was the emperor of the East, Anastasius, which was a late 4th and early 5th century Roman emperor, and he was already there during the time when it was a Christian empire at that point. But to rewind a little bit, at this point, Aurelian was deified after his death and had claimed, actually, in an interesting light, to be the representative on earth of God, in the sense that his god was the sun god of Sol Invictus, which was the invincible sun. This was a very popular god to have been worshipped in the polytheistic or pagan pantheon in Rome, as it was the god of choice for the soldiers and the military types. And Aurelian would actually start the long trend of Rome going from being a polytheistic, multi-religious, and openly tolerant culture to being a monotheistic state, in which originally it was Sol Invictus, which Aurelian had declared was going to be the one true god in which all in the empire would have to worship. Maybe they could have other gods, but Sol Invictus would have to be first and foremost. But later, obviously, that would change with Constantine and then later Theodosius I. Christianity would then become the state religion of the Roman Empire, and that would still be the case all until the way that it ended in 1453. But in Aurelian's time, he had really set the precedent for having a deity that would be basically a manifestation of the emperor's political legitimacy, and it would give the emperor a unique position in society as also the spiritual leader. And interestingly enough, he also obviously was the Pontifex Maximus. Ever since Augustus had taken that title from Marcus Lepidus when he died, the emperors would also have that as one of his many titles, and the Pontifex Maximus obviously was the religious leader of the Roman state, and that would remain the case until later Christian emperors had abandoned that title because of its pagan and polytheistic origins. But Aurelian had embraced it and had tried to use the concept of a monotheistic deity being the state religion to help him unify what was a divided empire. And at the time of his reign, obviously, I mentioned that the West had a breakaway state which had consisted of the former provinces of Roman Gaul, Roman Britannia, and Roman Hispania, which had actually been the latter provinces of Hispania was one of the first to have been reintegrated. But the Emperor Tetricus, who had inherited the title of emperor, had actually still maintained control of Gaul and Britannia. And then, if that wasn't enough, he was also Aurelian also lost the provinces in the east, some of the richest provinces of the Roman Empire, including its breadbasket of Egypt, or Aegyptus. And he also lost the Syrian province, which included the capital city of Antioch, which was the chief city in the east at that point, or one of the chief ones, as it rivaled Alexandria, and had also been the capital of the old Seleucid Empire, which was founded by Seleucus I Nicator, the successor of Alexander, whom was one of his diadochi. And that city obviously was now the capital of the Palmyrene Empire, or one of its chief cities, as it was based in Palmyra, but that was its chief city, as obviously Palmyra is a relatively of humble origins. You could actually visit modern Palmyra in Syria once the Syrian civil war is over. Fortunately, I think most of it was preserved despite an attempt from ISIS, the Islamic State, in recent days of trying to destroy the ruins. And it was unfortunate that Mr. Palmyra, the guy who was in charge, this old gentleman that was in charge of the ancient monuments, had actually been killed by ISIS. It's very unfortunate, and he refused to tell these terrorists that where these items were because they considered them idolatrous, much like the early Christians had considered the pagans of old to be idolatrous and had destroyed a lot of their ancient monuments. ISIS, in the same way, has been very intolerant when it came to accepting in the lands that they controlled objects deifying foreign deities, or what they see as foreign deities. But at the end of the day, these are all different iterations for, obviously these gods all have different cultural and historic context to them, but they all are manifestations of a common human desire to have something to believe in. And that sense of belief is something that has largely empowered the different peoples of different periods of time to have a reason to live, to have a sense of purpose. And I think to this day we can learn a lot when it comes to these different religions. You don't have to adhere to the particular ones from history, but they all are very insightful when it comes to understanding these cultures and being able to put what they're doing inside of a proper historical and political context. But I digress. Aurelian had lost all these key areas and also parts of Anatolia, and this was obviously unacceptable. I mean, Aurelian didn't lose them, but he had inherited an empire, actually, that had predecessors whom had screwed things up very badly. There was a lot of political instability during the crisis of the 3rd century. There were plagues, the Cyprian plague, which had ravaged the Roman population, the different Germanic tribes that were migrating due to climate change and their own lands having unrest, and different tribes such as the Huns forcing them to migrate to the west. And these different tribes, including the Vandals, the Alemanni, the Jutungi, the Goths, which are actually one of the more famous tribes, all these different tribes and more had tried to get into the Roman provinces, and this had caused a lot of unrest. And the fact of the matter was, at multiple points, the emperor himself was a person who was constantly like having the sword of Damocles over their head, in the sense that if they even did the wrong thing even once, the Praetorian Guards, which were supposed to be the emperor's personal bodyguards, would take it into their own hands to be kingmakers. And even at times when the empire really couldn't afford to have such a destabilizing change of leadership, in the sense that when you think of transitions of power, in the United States, many people here, including myself in the past, have taken for granted the fact that here we have elections, which as rigged as they are, in my opinion, they still allow for the peaceful transition of power. Many modern countries, such as the ones in Africa and even South America, mostly Africa and the Middle East, have all had recently different crises involving political legitimacy, whether you're talking about Syria, whether you're talking about Libya, which are all topics I'm definitely going to get into in the future, whether you even talk about Tunisia or Sudan or Egypt. All these different countries have had problems because of the fact that their political structures are fairly new, and the structures of these countries tend to be very unstable, especially when it comes to the transition of power, as many people who are in control do not want to lose control. And a lot of these people tend to, once they win an election, if their term is up and they can't run again and they feel like holding power, they will just violate their country's theoretical laws and attempt to obviously just be a dictator of some kind, which is nothing new, obviously. The Roman legions, actually, in the same sense, were the reason why that this type of instability had happened since even ancient times, and even beforehand in other empires as well. the emperor, or in such cases like Persia, the Shahanshah, or even in China with the Mandate of Heaven, they were not people that could just do what they wanted and without having to acquiesce anything at all. We like to think of these monarchs as obviously being God-given or claiming divine authority, the divine right of kings or something like that. But the reality is, most of these people, despite the claims of glory that they had, that many did believe in, there were different constituencies, such as the masses, the military aristocracy, the landed elite, such as the people who owned the the ancient versions of these different corporations, or like feudal, at least in like medieval times, these like feudal lords, or in like Japan, the shoguns. There were different peoples that had to be obviously catered to. And if any of these factions were upset, including the military or even the regular people or the elite, they could all do things to undermine, in a lot of ways, maybe even get rid of you. And obviously, Aurelian had ascended to the throne as essentially a usurper, but he was ascending to the throne because the empire, since the assassination of Severus Alexander and the end of the Severan dynasty by the Roman legions, which had in the past also had just had a track record of really being crappy bodyguards, if you think about the fact that their just whole reason for being formed were to protect the emperor. And at the end of the day, a lot of times, they ended up killing the emperor, such as when Caligula was betrayed or Domitian. And don't get me wrong, these emperors all weren't the best people. A lot of them actually had probably been sociopaths or people that at the very least you probably wouldn't want to be in the same room with nowadays. But be that as it may, a lot of them were very talented. And at the same time, even with their own sociopathic tendencies, which you can judge and critique on their merits accordingly, when you have someone who's just spontaneously killed and there's just nobody who could fill that void, there's just obviously a power vacuum that will cause political instability, as disparate factions of people will come out of the woodwork and try to claim the title of emperor. Or in some cases, at this point, since everyone was used to having an emperor, the Praetorians might force someone to be emperor. And there's been certain cases where obviously the empire's troops would, from the times of even Elagabalus being killed, obviously, and having Severus Alexander being elected, or even having Claudius, whom thought the legions were going to kill him, and ironically then made him emperor, as when Caligula was betrayed, Claudius was there. He was found groveling behind a curtain, hiding and being afraid of his life. He did not expect to be emperor. And even times like when the Byzantines, like Theodosius III, he was a tax collector whom was forced by the Opsikian theme of the later Roman Empire in the East to be emperor, even though he didn't want to be. And they were trying to do so because they were upset about the fact that their previous nominee, Anastasius II, had ended up backstabbing them and killing their leadership, this strategoi named George. But yes, I digress. There was a lot of instability, and Aurelian was thrown right in the thick of it. And I think in modern day now, it's very depressing when we see the quality of leadership, at least in the United States, and I'm sure many other countries across the world. Politicians, a lot of them just end up just saying whatever they need to say in order to either get elected or appease the masses. They know the right things to say. A lot of them are intelligent enough, at least to be able to read a room. As bad as Trump is, he knows how to read a room. He's good at marketing. And many of these people are relatively good rhetoricians, good enough to the point where people who aren't the most cued into what's going on policy-wise might mistake their rhetoric for reflecting their actual beliefs, when in reality, it's very easy to wear a mask and to say one thing and to do another. Politicians, since the beginning of time, are professional hypocrites, and they know how to get away with that type of stuff for the most part, or justify their political legitimacy in one way or another, whether it's through the sword or whether it's by the ballot box. Depending on the system, obviously, it's all formalities, but political power is something that is a universal factor when it comes to different human societies that have political structures that are beyond the simple, nomadic types that we used to have all been at one point in ancient days. At this point, most people live under a sophisticated modern state of some kind, whether you're talking about one that has abundancy of resources such as China, the United States, Russia, or Turkey, all of which are now different great powers trying to jockey for influence, which we will talk about in other videos and podcasts. But when it comes to the United States and all these other countries, they might have these political structures, obviously. But even when you think of other countries like Brazil, countries like Belgium or Egypt or Vietnam, or even like countries like Papua New Guinea, all these countries have some sort of semblance of a sophisticated bureaucratic system that allows them to maintain political control over the areas in which they are in charge of. I mean, at the end of the day, a political state, whether it's a republic, whether it's an empire, whether it's whatever, I mean, if it's functional enough, it essentially, at the end of the day, is a entity that wants to exercise dominance over a set territory. And that territory, obviously, is a geographic one. And that is why geopolitics as a particular field and international relations are all very important concepts to understand if one wants to have a nuanced version of understanding history and also understanding politics, as all these things are intertwined with each other. And obviously history is the story of what goes on these lands, but geopolitics is why these lands are factored into the system and how we make our decisions. As when you look at the world, we are all occupying different parts of it, and there's different regions that have different attributes, which all can, in their own ways, affect and be variables when it comes to the lived experiences of the people within them. And in the case of Rome had been for centuries, they were able to achieve this Pax Romana, much like the United States has had this Pax Americana, or the British had the Pax Britannia, the British peace, because of the fact that they were able to exercise dominance over a vast expanse of territory. And Egypt, for example, had paid for, I think, over half of the total revenues of the entire empire, and that was just a single imperial province. The emperor was one of the most powerful people in the world at his time, and at least Aurelian was. And as time passed on, Roman politics had become more of a theory than an actuality as they started losing territories. But Aurelian, at his time, the empire was looking like it was about to absolutely just collapse. And Aurelian actually lost his first military engagement as emperor against the Vandals in Italy and had to retreat back to Rome. However, fortunately, after being heckled and considered possibly just one of another list of long usurpers that were going to continue to fuck up and ruin everything, he actually was able to surprise his contemporaries and become the soldier emperor that he was. He had actually been born from very humble origins. He was definitely one of these new, Siri, sorry about that. I don't know why Siri went off. My bad, guys. But he was beyond just being a barracks emperor, he was also one of the Illyrian emperors that was from the province of Illyricum, which had these Illyrian peoples who had been at that point firmly Romanized, as this area had been part of the Roman Empire now for centuries, ever since the time of Augustus. And this particular province would produce a list of very talented emperors, some more than others, such as Aurelian, his successor Probus, his other successor Diocletian, and a lot of the other people, such as even Constantine. This area had all been part of what is ancient Illyricum, closer to like the Balkans, where the modern day countries of Croatia, Slovenia, I think, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, which is a disputed region. Albania. There's Greece. There's the Northern Republic of Macedonia, or I guess it's called that. And there was a whole name dispute between Greece and this Northern Republic, I guess, that wanted to call itself just Macedonia. There's a lot of, obviously, ethnic tensions in this area, and that has always been a constant fact. And it was because of the diverse history of this region, which had, over periods of different times, all the way up till today, had been controlled by some of the great powers of the world, including Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, and obviously then the Macedonians beforehand, the Persians, and there were even the pre-Romanians, which were the Dacians. And most famously, their king, Decebalus, actually, was one of the last great ones whom afterwards this area would actually be part of, I think, Lower and Upper Moesia and Pannonia, all these different regions that are different modern countries. And I named a few, but there's definitely several more, including Hungary and all these other places that had been formerly part of this Roman Empire, and Aurelian was from this area and had been, I think his mother was a priestess for the local sun god of Sol Invictus. There was actually a dispute between where he was actually born exactly, but it was definitely in that region. And it was thought to be by most people to be the region of Sirmium, which was later to be one of the tetrarchic capitals, and then later to be the capital, I think, of the Praetorian prefecture of Illyricum. And that was obviously a strategic city that was located on the Rhine that allowed the Romans to have a firm geopolitical access route to the frontiers and also be able to monitor the different Germanic tribes, which were edging closer and closer to the Roman frontiers and had been starting to raid territories. And at this point, the Germans had been living alongside the Romans for centuries and had long started joining the army as foreign troops, mercenaries, and on top of that had been in combat enough with the Romans where they started to understand their strategies and were able to have technology in terms of their military equipment that reflected the Romans and were able to match them sword for sword. And there was actually a later period in which German swords were actually higher quality than the Roman ones, in case you didn't know. But Aurelian at this point was in a lot of trouble, and he was able to get his act together, and within these 5 years he was able to repel these Germanic tribes and awe them with the fact that he was able to perform military maneuvers which were completely not expected. And at the same time, he was able to then go, there's a dispute, as of the video I watched, or the TV series, it was thought that he went to Palmyra first and then he went to Gaul. In fact, it's more likely at this point that that was in reverse. He actually pacified the Gallic emperor Tetricus, whom some believe actually surrendered beforehand or agreed to sabotage his own troops as he didn't want to be emperor. Aurelian actually had spared his life, and he would be paraded later with the Palmyrene empress Zenobia at the Roman triumph that he held at the end of his reign. And I mean, this was something that was unheard of. If you would have thought when he was retreating back to the city of Rome after he had lost against the Vandals when he first assumed power, that he was, within a short period of time, going to go from being booed by the crowds and being seen as just possibly one of many Roman emperors that were just going to be a part of this complete annihilation and have just been nothing but a placeholder, to being one that had been able to enter this city in triumph. In between, he actually crossed, by the way, before I forget, into Egypt and had stopped a local rebellion there from a papyrus trader who had the funds to hire a small private army. Aurelian had crushed him and actually executed that guy, but the other usurpers, Zenobia and Tetricus, were paraded and allowed to live afterwards by Aurelian's clemency and mercy, which I actually respect in the sense that I think he understood that these also were, not only were they usurpers, but at the same time, in their own ways, they had shown that they were willing to help Aurelian, like in the sense of Tetricus. Tetricus saw it, and I think it was more likely that he did not want to have to go against Aurelian. He saw how he was able to awe these Germanic tribes, and he would probably have rather saved his life and probably cut out a deal beforehand. I'm just a cynic, but that's just I agree with that particular narrative. Maybe I'm wrong, but if you think I'm wrong, let me know. And with Zenobia, at least, Zenobia actually had impressed Aurelian in the sense that at that time period, it was very uncommon for women to actually be political leaders. Boudica, in particular, had actually scared Nero into almost abandoning the province of Roman Britain completely. And in general, there were just not that many female leaders throughout history, at least not in ancient times, that were willing to just grab the reins of power like that and had actually been able to prove to be pretty competent. She was able to seize the Roman breadbasket of Egypt and was able to carve out a very significant Syrian-based empire. And many Syrians to this day learn about Palmyra in their schools and are taught to have a lot of pride in the sense that this short-lived empire was really able to cover a large expanse of the modern-day Middle East and much of the modern Arab world. But at the time, this was obviously controlled by the Romans. And Zenobia herself actually was the wife of of a Roman governor of this area that was able to successfully repel the Persians. She had a son whom she actually ruled through and had him as an Augustus, but she obviously eventually did lose, and Despite that, obviously, Aurelian had spared both of them and had them be paraded along with other prisoners of war during his triumph. And this Roman triumph, obviously, was one of the last ones to be held, other than Diocletian's, in Rome, where it was truly over something that was worth being a triumph over. A lot of these later triumphs would be watered down, and the later Romans under Justinian and Belisarius would have a Christian version of this in New Rome of Constantinople in later centuries. However, at that point, it was very different, and this ancient tradition of having the Roman concept, the Roman triumph, at least as Augustus or any of the Republican era consuls and military leaders would have understood it, had really just culminated with Aurelian. And this would be one of the last triumphs to ever really be held that would deserve the title of being a triumph. Aurelian had paraded around elephants and had ambassadors from China, from Ethiopia, from Persia, from all these distant lands, from the Turkic Khaganates and the different Germanic tribes. He had also had different prisoners of war from the varying Germanic tribes and the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrene Empire. He had saved Rome from what looked like a total destruction. And it's very much within question, if it wasn't Aurelian, who would have been in charge and what would have really happened? A really big what if that could make its own video in and of itself. But I digress. Aurelian really was someone who came from humble origins and then had, despite his humble upbringing, been able to prove through military genius that he was able to be a worthy Roman emperor. And he also had a lot of other policies, such as trying to reform the currency, which had caused strikes afterwards from the mint workers. And unfortunately, his willingness to not just be a military leader, but also a politician and try to start to modify the empire in a way that would help it long-term sustain itself, as reform he obviously thought was necessary for the continued survival, and that this crisis of the 3rd century, despite him reunifying the empire politically, had not been completely over, and it wouldn't end until his successors, Diocletian, would really come to power and introduce the Tetrarchy and usher in the period of the Roman dominant, along with the later Emperor Constantine, whom I'll talk about in later podcasts. But at least with Aurelian, and within 5 years, he was able to retake all of the lands that his predecessors had lost, reintegrate them politically, and attempt to reform the economy. And then finally, and I'm sure I missed a little bit of that other stuff. If I missed anything about Aurelian, let me know in the comment section below. He is definitely someone who is worth having a look at, an interesting figure. And it's unfortunate now that at the end of his 5-year reign, after setting down the groundwork and laying really a firm foundation for the future of the Roman Empire going forward, he had planned on going into Persia and avenging the dishonorable capture of the former Emperor Valerian, whom was under the auspices of being able to negotiate peace, captured by Shapur I, the Shahanshah of the Sassanid Persian Empire, and then had been kidnapped and had been the first Roman emperor in history, but not the last, to have been captured by a foreign enemy in battle. And the battle was supposed to be a truce, and there was a white flag, and this was obviously a gross diplomatic overreach. Both the Romans and the Persians didn't really follow anything from what we would understand to be some sort of Geneva Convention. Neither do most of the modern states. A lot of that's a formality and something that would be great, but mostly is an ideal that in practice really is never implemented fully, and we're all guilty, I think, of that. All countries have had instances of human rights or just clearly things that would be considered war crimes. And I mean, look at the U.S. presidents, for example. I think that obviously will tell you enough if you're paying attention to what they're doing. And that's all of them, honestly, regardless of their political party. But these emperors, obviously, compared to the Roman emperors, I guess the presidents weren't that bad in terms of how ruthless they were. But with Aurelian, he had put down multiple revolts and was a strict disciplinarian. He had earned the loyalty of his troops by bringing them victories that were beyond their imagination. And he was able to save the Roman Empire from what seemed like certain collapse. And all within 5 years. I mean, within 5 years, I feel like I'd be happy if I was able to just, have a YouTube channel that would get a decent amount of listeners where I'm not essentially talking to myself. But I mean, maybe I just have a low bar and low standards to set. I like to talk about these topics. I definitely want to collaborate and hopefully materialize these concepts into tangible things where they could be of use to people and hopefully benefit society. But that is nowhere near the level of greatness which someone like Aurelian, whom I really admire personally for multiple reasons, had been able to do within such a short period of time. And it's unfortunate because of his strict disciplinary nature, his taking no bullshit from people whom obviously didn't understand their place when it came to dealing with someone who was able to merit the authority that he held. He had obviously then, with that kind of mentality, like anyone in that mentality would be doing in their situation, made enemies in the political order. And in particular, there was a scribe whom was definitely going to be put to death if they were Aurelian would have found out how badly they screwed up on doing things. And instead of obviously taking that punishment like a man, or not being corrupt or being someone who deserves to be punished, this scribe had lied to the military brass, the military leadership, the Praetorians, and had told them actually that Aurelian was planning on executing all of them. They obviously panicked and overreact, and instead of asking him, potentially afraid that he was going to possibly lash out, they actually, on the way, while they were in what was ancient Thrace, and today I think like modern Turkey area, maybe Romania or Bulgaria, Greece-ish, that area in particular was where Aurelian unfortunately died. He was refilling water, and then he was betrayed by his troops, whom promptly murdered him. And with the death of Aurelian really was the end of a potential shorter period of the crisis of the 3rd century, which would last until Diocletian in 285 became emperor and had to go through his own series of civil wars and fights for just maintaining political territorial integrity of the Roman political state. And it was really unfortunate, as once it was discovered that the scribe had lied, he was put to death anyway. But unfortunately, Aurelian, despite claiming to have been the representation on earth of the deity Sol Invictus, had clearly not been able to come back to life, and not even the god of soldiers, just like the TV show had said, had not been able to really protect him, because at the end of the day, he had met a really brutal end. And it's really sad, because it's a great what if, in the sense that if he had more time, would he have laid down a dynasty, or maybe have been the Constantine that of Sol Invictus, of not Christianity but Roman paganism? And maybe would the sun god be this modern religion that everybody in Western Europe and much of even areas like Korea and other parts of the world, such as the Middle East, would be worshipping, in terms of, instead of these being Christians, maybe they would just be different denominations of sun worship. Very interesting concept, I think, and just potentially some alternate reality that would make an interesting video in and of itself. But obviously that potentiality ended with the death of Aurelian in 275 AD. The Roman Empire was again plunged into a series of civil wars, and at the end of the day, obviously Diocletian and Constantine would usher in the Roman dominant, and Roman society as they knew it at the time would fundamentally change. But that would be other topics for another video. I hope you enjoyed listening and watching to this one. This is definitely me just testing the waters on how this is going to go. I probably missed out on too much when it came to Aurelian. Within that 5 years, he was definitely able to squeeze in more than a lifetime's worth of efforts. And even before he was emperor, he had actually been in the military and had risen through the ranks, which is all something I should have definitely went over, but would be more of an interesting topic, I guess, for another day, as I think this podcast is relatively long as is. And I don't want to make it over an hour yet, because I really don't know how the reception is going to be. So, I mean, let's just test things out, see how it goes. If you enjoyed this, please leave a comment and a positive review, I guess, or at least let me know what you think. If you disagreed, please let me know where I bumbled, or if I missed something out. I'd be happy to have a dialogue over that. And make sure to follow me on social media. I've started using it a little bit more. Honestly, I definitely should make a video about that and podcast. I have very mixed feelings when it comes to social media, but I think for academic and scholarly pursuits, or ones in which are encouraging the same passion of learning that I was able to get in spite of going to schools in the United States, in which I really feel like they're designed to discourage people from enjoying learning. And I think that's another topic, obviously, for another day, but it's just a little bit of insight. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. I've rambled long enough. Let me know what you think, and I appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, please make sure to subscribe over at youtube.com/GetNuanced, and I'll catch you in the next one I make real soon. For now, stay safe. Peace out.